Hello, my name is Dr. Cody Yeager, the Avian Field Specialist in APHIS Animal Care. In this video, we will review the types of activities involving birds that require a USDA animal care license or registration. A license and/or a registration may be required depending on the types of activities you are carrying out involving birds. For businesses that breed, sell, or broker the sale of or exhibit birds, a license may be required. For businesses that are involved in the transportation of birds owned by someone else or conduct research involving birds, a registration may be required. There are three types of licenses. Class A licenses are for people breeding and selling birds hatched on their property. Class B licenses are for people who purchase and then resell birds that were not hatched on their property. And Class C licenses are for those who exhibit birds to the public. We will review the registration types later on in this presentation. A person applying for a new license must submit an application and undergo an inspection to demonstrate full compliance with the regulations before a license is issued. There is no pre-registration inspection when applying for a registration. For more information on the application process, please refer to our third video that goes over step-by-step instructions on how to apply for a license or registration. Now let's discuss exemptions and thresholds for licensure as it relates to birds. It's always helpful to first start with activities that are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act. Avian use activities that do not require a license or registration includes birds solely used or intended to be used for food, fiber, or improving animal nutrition, breeding management, or production efficiency, or for improving the quality of food or fiber. In other words, birds used for typical farm or agricultural purposes are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act. Other activities that are not covered include exhibition of exclusively domesticated farm-type animals that are intended to advance the agricultural arts and sciences, birds used in falconry or used to promote falconry, birds used in pigeon races or bird fancier shows, and birds kept solely for an individual's own use or enjoyment. This includes persons who free fly their own birds solely for their own use and enjoyment. Anyone who sells regulated birds that were hatched on their property for use as a pet or for exhibition must be licensed unless they fall under one of the license exemptions. Most breeders selling their birds hatched on their property will fall into this Class A type of licensure. Now, let's look at the licensing thresholds for Class A licenses, which are required when selling birds for use as pets or for exhibition that were hatched on your premises. If you sell more than 200 pet bird species having an average body weight of 250 grams or less annually, or if you sell more than 8 pet bird species having an average body weight of more than 250 grams annually, a license is required. For these purposes, body weights are those of the average adult for that species. As examples, pet birds at or below 250 grams typically include cockatiels, finches, lovebirds, and parakeets, while pet birds over 250 grams typically include most cockatoos and macaws, Amazons, and African gray parrots. Pet bird species are defined by the regulations as those that have been commonly kept as pets in U.S. households. Please see our complete list of pet birds defined on our website titled Species List of Pet Birds as Defined by the Animal Welfare Regulations. Sales of birds of any species not on this list requires a license regardless of the size or number sold annually, unless already exempted from licensure. As established by the Retail Pet Store Rule, pet species of birds that are sold in face-to-face transactions in which the seller, buyer, and pet bird are all physically present at the time of sale are exempted from licensure. This includes pet bird sales at pet stores or bird shows. Brokers selling pet birds and businesses selling non-pet bird species must be licensed unless exempted from licensure. Face-to-face retail pet bird sales are also exempted from the size and number thresholds covered on the previous slide. Additionally, you may conduct sales of pet bird species by both face-to-face sales and non-face-to-face sales without a license as long as those non-face-to-face sales are below the size and number threshold covered on the previous slide. For sales of any non-pet bird species, the seller must have proper permits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as any permits required by the state and local governments, if applicable. Anyone who resells or negotiates the purchase or sale of regulated birds as a dealer, also called brokering, must be licensed as a Class B dealer, unless they fall under one of the license exemptions. Class B dealers can include brokers, auctions, and some rescues. USDA considers compensation to include any remuneration for the animal, regardless of whether or not it is for profit or not for profit. Remuneration includes, but is not limited to, sales, adoption fees, donations, or other benefits received for related activities. Anyone engaged in any of these activities and receiving remuneration may meet the definition of a dealer. Finally, let's discuss the Class C license for animal exhibition. The Animal Welfare Act defines an exhibitor as any person, public or private, exhibiting any animals which were purchased in commerce or the intended distribution of which affects commerce or will affect commerce to the public for compensation. Examples involving birds include carnivals, circuses, animal acts, zoos, educational exhibits, petting zoos, public walk-in aviaries, photo shoots with birds, and birds being given away as prizes or used to attract business. Unless exempted for reasons we have already reviewed, a license is required if you're exhibiting more than 8 pet animals, including pet birds, small exotic or wild mammals, and/or domesticated farm-type animals, including birds such as poultry. Additionally, you may exhibit up to 4 raptors without a license if you hold a valid permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In all other circumstances, exhibition of any non-pet bird requires a license. In summary, the exhibition of 8 or fewer pet bird species or 4 or fewer raptors with a valid U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permit is exempt from licensure. Some businesses conduct multiple types of regulated activity, such as selling offspring of animals that they also use for exhibition. You are not required to have multiple licenses because each class of license allows you to conduct other types of regulated activity. The primary activity for which the birds are used determines what class of license you will need. We will now review the registration types. Remember, there is no fee or pre-registration inspection when applying for a registration. There are 2 types of registration for activities involving the transportation of animals. The first is for carriers, which are operators of any airline, railroad, motor carrier, shipping line, or other enterprise engaged in the business of transporting any animal for hire. This is by far the more common of the two types of registration related to transportation. It includes anyone who is hired to transport animals to places such as pet stores or to the buyer of an animal. The second is for the intermediate handlers, who are people that receive animals in custody in connection with their transportation in commerce. This requirement covers boarding facilities that take responsibility for shipping animals or receiving them during or after shipment. Now let's cover registration necessary when using birds in research. First and foremost, it is important to understand that birds that are bred for use in research are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act. Under the animal welfare regulations, the term "bred for use in research" is now defined as an animal that is bred in captivity and used for research, teaching, testing, or experimentation purposes. What this means is that birds hatched in captivity and used in research, including teaching, testing, or experimentation purposes, are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act and regulations. However, any bird captured in the wild and used for research purposes is covered under the Animal Welfare Act. Now, what about eggs? Eggs are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act. So when does an egg become a bird? Under the regulations, an egg is considered a bird once the hatching process begins, and at that point, the bird is then covered by the regulations. Unless, of course, the bird is exempt for any of the reasons we've discussed. There are several research study types that are excluded from coverage under the Animal Welfare Act, such as field studies conducted on free-living wild birds in their natural habitat that do not involve invasive procedures, harm, or materially alter the behavior of a bird under study, or studies for the purpose of supporting agriculture. In other words, studies that are intended to improve the quality of food or feathers derived from birds. Next, animal pest and population management studies for the purpose of limiting wildlife damage and human interaction are excluded. Additionally, studies involving avian patients in clinical trials in the context of medical care under a veterinarian client-patient relationship. And finally, studies using only dead biological specimens, in other words, studies not involving live birds, would be excluded from coverage under the Animal Welfare Act. I also want to inform you about our licensing and registration assistant, which is an online tool on our website that helps determine whether or not you need a license or registration by answering a series of questions. The tool also provides you a link to the starting point for an application for a license or registration. Lastly, I understand every business is different, and you may still have questions regarding your need for a license or registration. If that is the case, please contact our office in Fort Collins, Colorado at 970-494-7478 or email us at animalcare@usda.gov. I hope you found this presentation helpful and thank you for your time today.